Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles. And all the opinions you'll need, whether it's digital or by post. Subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. We're going to begin today's business with general questions, and the first question is from Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to make ferry travel more accessible.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Scottish Government is committed to improving access to ferry travel. Operators of the Clyde and Hebrides and Northern Isles ferry contracts provide assistance, services and equipment to enable individuals with reduced mobility to access ferry services. Both continually review their service provisions to try and reduce the barriers to travel for people with reduced mobility. In 2014, the Ferries Accessibility Fund was set up to support improvements in accessibility. From 4 rounds of the fund, we have awarded around £338,000 towards a range of projects improving accessibility across the network.
Donald Cameron.
Can I welcome those developments? But the Minister will be aware of the widespread alarm which greeted one of the proposals in the Scottish Ferries Plan, namely to increase peak time ferry fares. A resident on Isla has told me that hiking fares on Lifeline services will only serve to discourage people from living in our island communities. What assurances can the Minister give to people across the Highlands and Islands that they will not be impacted by such a proposal? And more specifically, how does such a proposal interrelate with RET?
Minister.
Well, clearly we recognise the concern that ferry users of Lifeline services have about accessibility to services when they need them. Obviously, I really appreciate that in the region that Mr Cameron represents, that ferry services are vital for economic activity as well as for social and other health-related uses. So we take such matters very seriously. I certainly would be happy to meet with Mr Cameron to discuss his concerns about issues that have been raised directly with him, but happy to engage in that level. But we certainly are keen to reduce fares, as we've shown with RET, and to try and introduce fairness across the network and make sure that anomalies in fares are addressed as well. And we certainly continue to undertake that on an ongoing basis.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister advise the Chamber what ferry car and passenger numbers were in 2007? What were those corresponding numbers last year? And how much has the Scottish Government's introduction of road equivalent tariff helped improve passenger access in terms of affordability?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The number of cars carried by CalMac in 2007 was 1.06 million compared to 1.43 million in 2018. That's an increase of 34%. Passenger figures in 2007 were 4.73 million compared with 5.27 million in 2018, an increase of 11.5%. We certainly very much welcome the growing demand for ferry services, and as reflected in the answer to Mr Cameron, we're keen to obviously maintain fares as low as we can. This reflects the popularity of our islands, of course, the growing demand with tourists and the success of our policy to introduce RET. But in the 3 years since the full rollout of RET in October 2015, passenger numbers across the Clyde and Hebrides services increased by 14% and car numbers increased by 25%, which shows the success of the policy. And we have commissioned a study to reassure Mr Gibson and other members that will estimate the impact of RET on demand for ferry services across the network, and this research will also help to identify the medium to long-term effects of RET to inform future policy decisions, and we expect that to be completed by the end of 2019.
Question number 2, Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what progress is being made on tendering the Northern Isles Ferry Services contract.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The invitation to tender for the next contract to run the Northern Isles Ferry Services was issued to 3 bidders on the 17th of January of this year. Submission of final tender bids is scheduled for spring of this year, followed by the tender evaluation period, with the contract due to start on the 31st of October 2019.
Tavish Scott.
Can I thank the Minister for that reply? When will the Minister be in a position to publish the specification for the tender, given no one in Orkney or Shetland knows what's in it yet? Does that tender specification have any improvements on the current contract? And will the Minister make clear who the third company bidding is, as we well know that Serco and indeed the Minister's own choice, CalMac, are already 2 out of the 3 companies?
Minister.
We are committed to fair, open and transparent tender, which aims to get the best deal for the communities that depend on the ferry services serving Mr Scott's constituents and others in the Northern Isles. It is important that the identity of the bidders remains confidential at this stage in the procurement procedure, and we will be discussing the procurement procedure with bidders in the coming weeks, following which we intend to publish the ITT on the Transport Scotland website, and I'll make sure that Mr Scott is aware when that is published. We will also review whether it would be appropriate to identify the individual bidders at that point for the clarity that Mr Scott is seeking. I think in terms of the points about the improvements to the service, I should say that we've, after extensive consultation with stakeholders, including hopefully elected members such as Mr Scott, Mr MacArthur and others, we have sought out to try and produce as much flexibility in the new contract to allow variations in services and timetables to be undertaken with greater ease than under the current contract. And I hope that is something that those representing the community served by the services will welcome.
And Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Will the Scottish Government ensure that vessels on the Northern Isles Ferry Services contract are covered by collective bargaining agreements with the maritime unions? Will this be part of the specifications for the contract?
Minister.
In terms of the point that Mr Smith recognises, I recognise very much the point he's making and about trying to ensure that we have fair working practices in all procurement contracts that the Scottish Government is associated with, and certainly assure Mr Smith that we are strongly encouraging through the ITT good engagement with trade unions and other stakeholders, and I will happily, as soon as I'm able to give detail to Mr Smith about what is specifically in the ITT on those issues. Hope that will be of help to him.
Question number 3, Mark Ruskell.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government how commuters' views inform ScotRail timetabling changes.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Ahead of the December 2018 timetable change, ScotRail consulted with local authorities and regional transport partnerships who represent passengers' interests throughout the timetable development process. ScotRail has also adopted a new approach to the May 2019 timetable change by publishing its proposals and inviting customers to comment. We are not aware of this level of consultation being undertaken by any other UK train operating company. ScotRail has already made changes to its proposals as a result of responses received from its website, social media and from correspondence. And ScotRail will also observe how customers are using the current timetable.
Mark Ruskell.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. I mean, notwithstanding the national discussions that took place with passenger groups, there was really zero consultation with commuters using the Dunblane to Edinburgh services, which led to the withdrawal of the only service that would actually take people to Edinburgh in time for the start of the working day. So what influence can the Cabinet Secretary bring to the May timetable in light of the public consultation so that it actually serves the needs of commuters?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, there was an extensive consultation that was undertaken since 2015 in preparation for the timetable changes in December 2018, and that also included an independent assessment of the proposed changes being undertaken by TACTRANS in looking at the impact it would have on passengers and customers using these particular services. And as a result, although there were some who were negatively affected by the timetable changes, the vast majority of those would benefit from the timetable change. As ever with any timetable change, there is a weighing up of the pros and cons that go with this. An independent report verified that the choice that was made for the timetable change was one which would benefit a greater number of the travelling public. However, what will happen going forward is that ScotRail will review the existing timetable as it beds down to consider where there are further changes that can be made in order to try and improve issues where there are matters of concern. However, there will always be a level of restriction and capacity on the network to be able to accommodate all passengers' needs.
Angus MacDonald, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Further to the Cabinet Secretary's response, he'll be aware of inquiries I've made to his office regarding the removal of a direct train service between Pomont and Stirling on the Dunblane route, and he'll also be aware there is a similar issue for commuters in Linlithgow. Does he agree with me that ScotRail should reconsider these changes implemented in December, which are affecting many of my constituents, and that consideration should be given to reinstating direct services to Stirling from Pomont and Linlithgow as a matter of priority?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I stated, Presiding Officer, in my earlier response to Mr Ruskell, is that there is limited capacity within the network and there is always a balance that needs to be struck in terms of any timetabling arrangements. But if it's of interest to remember, of the 1.2 million journeys made from Linlithgow and Pomont last year, these were split. Broadly, 70% were to or from Edinburgh, 20% to or from Glasgow, with 5% to or from Falkirk or Stirling. And given the need to make sure that we try to address issues such as overcrowding, improve connectivity, faster journey times, and also to deal with the growth that we have on the use of our rail network, there's a need to try and strike a balance and trying to get a timetable that meets the widest number of passengers' needs as possible. And that's what the intentions were with the timetable change on the 9th of December. But I am aware of the concerns that the members raised, as the issues that were raised by Mr Ruskell. And of course, these are matters that will continue to be considered by ScotRail for any future timetable changes within the limitations of what can be achieved within the network.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will know of the timetabling changes which resulted in an up to 30-minute wait at Montrose. Surely if the Scottish Government cared about North East commuters' views, it would have improved facilities and sought their views before making those changes. So did it seek commuters' views in the North East, and when will those facilities be improved?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, obviously the member conveniently ignores the fact that we're investing some £300 million in the rail network in the north east of Scotland to improve connectivity within that particular area, and we've also seen a significant increase in the number of services which are available now within the north east of Scotland as well. However, on the point which the member raised, there was a consultation undertaken, as I said, for the timetable change in 2018, which involved a whole range of regional transport partnerships, including those within the north east of Scotland. And as the member will be aware, ScotRail are presently evaluating the improvements that they want to make to the Montrose station, and that work is planned to be scheduled and taken forward in due course.
And Jackie Bailey.
As part of the timetable changes, my area was promised that there would be 6 carriage trains, particularly at rush hours, yet in the months since, commuters have experienced short-form services with 3 carriages appearing instead of 6 and passengers crammed in like sardines. I know that there is no limit on the number of passengers that ScotRail try to squeeze on their trains, but can the Cabinet Secretary tell me whether there is anything in the contract with ScotRail about the capacity of the service?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the member will be aware that we are making significant investment in order to upgrade the rolling stock we have within the ScotRail franchise, which is resulting in some 70 new Hitachi trains being introduced into the network in order to provide overall a 23% increase in seating capacity across the network. Part of the challenge in some of the routes has been the late delivery and supply of the Hitachi trains. and also the refurbished HST high-speed trains, which are having an impact on the cascade of the rest of the rolling stock across the rest of the network. Once we have all the additional rolling stock in place, that will allow us to make sure that we maximise the use of the rolling stock to address areas where there are, and I recognise there are areas where there is congestion, and overcrowding on some trains, which is unacceptable and is a matter which is addressed within the franchise, but we need to get the additional rolling stock in place in order to address these matters, and that will be taken forward in the months ahead when it actually supply the rest of the trains which are due to have provided by now.
Question number 4, Neil Bibby.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last discussed congestion on the M8 between the St James's Interchange and Glasgow City Centre with Transport Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Transport Scotland, as an agency of the Scottish Government, discusses operational matters relating to the Scottish motorway and trunk road network with ministers on a regular basis.
Bibby.
The M8 between Paisley and Glasgow is the busiest stretch in the country, and Renfrewshire businesses are warning us that congestion is deterring investment. Last week, all parties voted for an amendment stating that the Glasgow Airport Access Project, which I remind the Cabinet Secretary is a tram train project, must be progressed urgently. The SNP scrapped Garrow in 2009. 10 years on, people don't want any more delays, reports, studies or excuses. They just want you to get on with it. When will the SNP deliver the rail link they voted for last week? And if they won't, will he explain to businesses and people in my region why on earth not?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, the motorway link at the west and the M8 is a key link to the airport and also to the rest of the west of Scotland, and it's an area where we are aware of the congestion which has been caused there and need to make sure that that's addressed. That's an issue which will be addressed within STPR2, and I've asked officials to make sure that it's given priority. The member will also be aware that the Glasgow Airport Access Project team, which is led by Glasgow City Council and Renfrewshire Council, have been reviewing the evidence that was presented to on the independent audit of the outline business case for the tram train link to Glasgow Airport. They've identified that there's a number of issues which are outstanding with that causes real challenges in being able to deliver such a project. They've now identified that their preferred option is a personal rapid transit service which will be provided, and that's a matter which is now the preferred option and will be presented to the Glasgow City Regional Deal Cabinet in the coming weeks to consider in taking forward the outline business case for that proposal.
Question number 5, Johann Lamont.
With a degree of optimism, to ask the Scottish Government when work will begin on the Glasgow Airport Access Project and how it will ensure it is delivered as outlined in the business case.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
The Glasgow Airport Access Project is one of the projects identified in the Glasgow City Region Deal and is being taken forward by Glasgow City and Renfrewshire councils. As such, responsibility for the delivery of the project to improve surface access to the airport sits with those councils. The Scottish Government remains committed to working with partners to find solutions to improve surface access to Glasgow Airport. As part of that commitment, I chaired the Glasgow Airport Access Executive Steering Group yesterday. At this meeting, the group heard how the project team have considered issues raised in the independent audit of the project's outlined business case. I was pleased to hear that Glasgow City Region Deal has recognised current and future rail service issues which would be compromised as a result of their outlined business case, and as such are now seeking to take forward a preferred option which is for a personalised rapid transit option, and that outlined business case will be developed by the partners.
Johann Lamont.
I can't tell the Cabinet Secretary how utterly dismayed I am by the response he has just given us. He may be pleased. This Parliament, including the Minister himself, voted last week for urgent progress on the deal and plan as outlined in the business case. I don't know what he defines as urgent. What he has said now is not urgent. So I can ask the Cabinet Secretary, who is it that is putting a block on a proposal where the money is there, the plan is agreed by the partners, it is recognised as having social, economic and environmental benefits to Glasgow and the west of Scotland, and it's still not going to happen. Will the Cabinet Secretary commit himself to act on the position he voted for last week in the interest of the people of Glasgow and the west of Scotland, change this decision and make sure he goes back to the proposal that did have agreement unanimously by the City deal partners?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we have acted on it. As I mentioned, the meeting yesterday set out that it's going to take forward a business case for a PRT system. As a member will be aware, the outline business case had an independent audit of it carried out, which highlighted a number of very significant issues, in particular constraints at Glasgow Central and the potential impact that that would have on services to Inverclyde, Ayrshire and also to East Kilbride, all of which would have actually saw a reduction or a detrimental impact on their service. And also it would have been preventing the enhancements we intend to provide to these particular services. Therefore, because these issues could not be addressed through the outline business case, that's why the City deal partners have identified a PRT system as their preferred option, and they now intend to take that forward.
Jamie Green.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. The first feasibility study for this was done when I was 10 years of age. Cabinet Secretary, passenger numbers are set to double in the next 10 years. The number of people working on site is set to increase to around 40,000. It is simply inconceivable that this can be achieved relying solely on the M8, which is already heavily congested. Does the Cabinet Secretary think that the rail link realistically will be built any time soon?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, in terms of 2 points the member raises, one in terms of the M8, and I recognise the congestion issues there are on the M8 to the west of Glasgow, and that's an issue which has to be addressed. That will be taken forward through STPR2, and I've asked that to be a matter which is given priority consideration. But I'd be interested in knowing the member's views as to whether he would be content with the idea of a tram train link going into Glasgow Airport that would result in a reduction in services to his constituents in Inverclyde, or to constituents in Ayrshire, or to constituents who are in East Kilbride because of the limited capacity that is at Glasgow Central. We have to take a whole system approach to this in order to address these issues, not to look at them in isolation. And that's exactly what we've been doing in working with the partners around improving surface access to Glasgow Airport. And as has been recognised now, that's why they will now take forward the idea of a PRT as their preferred option in order to improve connectivity at the airport.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that my constituents in the Greenock and Inverclyde constituency will be shocked and also disappointed to hear that the Labour Party are campaigning to actually have a worse service as a consequence of this Glasgow access rail link?
Well,
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the reality is that there is limited capacity. There is limited capacity at.
Okay, order, please. Order. Let's hear the Cabinet Secretary. Let's hear the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there is limited capacity on the line from Paisley-Gilmore Street into Central Station. And even with enhancements, that would still result in a detriment to services to places such as Inverclyde, to Ayrshire and also to East Kilbride, and potentially also to the Shotts line as well. And there is also significant enhancements planned for these particular routes, given demand that there is on these existing routes. And that's why the outline business case and the independent audit has identified these issues that need to be addressed, and that's why they are now proposing to take through a PRT option, which is one which will improve connectivity to the airport, while at the same time allowing us to increase capacity for these other key areas where there's ever-growing demand for rail services.
Thank you very much, and that concludes general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions, and we begin with question number 1 from Jackson Carver.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, the desperate further news from Glasgow's Princess Royal Maternity Hospital last night will have shocked us all here and across Scotland, and our deepest sympathies go out to the families of the 2 babies who have died. For any new parents, there can be no news worse to bear, and it will have been difficult also for the many dedicated healthcare staff involved as well. In the light of these events, can I simply invite the First Minister to update the Chamber?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Jackson Carlow for that opportunity? I also want to begin today by putting on record my heartfelt and sincere condolences to the parents of the 2 babies who died after contracting staph aureus infection. There is also a 3rd baby who remains in neonatal intensive care, and I'm sure the best wishes and the thoughts of everyone across the Parliament are with that child, their parents and wider families. Our primary concern, and indeed that of the Health Board, is the safety and well-being of patients and their families at all times. The Health Board is taking all necessary steps to manage this incident and ensure patient safety. They've been in contact with affected families as well as with other families in the unit to advise them of the incident and the actions that they are taking. These actions include regular screening of the newborn children and providing information to patients, families and staff. Enhanced cleaning schedules have been put in place. A review of standard infection control precautions, for example, hand hygiene, cleaning of equipment, correct use of personal protective equipment is also being undertaken. And lastly, the board has asked Health Protection Scotland to investigate the incident and provide a report. The last thing I will say, Presiding Officer, and I would preface this by saying I am in no way trying to detract in saying this from the seriousness of the incident we are discussing today. But Staphylococcus aureus is unfortunately not an uncommon infection in people in hospital, including with neonatal babies. And indeed that infection can be found in around 1 in 4 people. So that makes it all the more important that hospitals have in place rigorous infection control procedures, and it is my job, the Health Secretary's job, working with the Board and Health Protection Scotland and indeed with Healthcare Environment Inspectorate to ensure that that is the case. But for now, I know all of our thoughts will be with the families affected.
Jackson Carlow.
Minister, for that, and also in relation to the last point she made, completely endorse that, and I'm framing my questions very much today in the light of that understanding. We learned from the statement released by Greater Glasgow Health Board that the investigation into this case was triggered last Thursday, the 24th of January. Will the First Minister say when she and the Health Secretary were first made aware by the Health Board of these cases, and what specific assurances ministers have since sought?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary became aware of these infections, I understand, on Monday of this week, and at that point asked for assurances. And of course, given the previous incidents that we were discussing last week, as you would expect, the Health Secretary, I beg your pardon, has been in regular contact with the Health Board. There are standard procedures in place, which I know have been the subject of discussion over the last few days about the actions that health boards require to take to assess infection outbreaks and the reporting and notification requirements that they have to undertake, and we're satisfied that the Health Board in all of these cases has done that. The important thing, of course, is that all of us ensure that not just in Greater Glasgow Health Board but in all health boards proper infection control procedures are in place, and the Health Secretary and her officials are taking all appropriate steps to ensure that that is the case.
Jackson Carlow.
Turning to the wider picture, there was a report last week that across Scotland around half of hospitals have not been inspected by the Healthcare Environment Inspectorate since it was set up a decade ago. Now, when asked about it during a television interview on Sunday, the Health Secretary agreed that if true this would be unacceptable. To be clear, we do know that the Princess Royal Maternity was last inspected in 2017 and met the targets it had been set. But the question remains, is it the case, as has been reported, that around half of Scotland's hospitals have not been inspected by HEI in the last decade? And if not, irrespective of the number, what steps are being made now to ensure that they are?
Well, again, let me seek to give Jackson Carlow and the Chamber as full information on this as I possibly can. The Healthcare Environment Inspectorate was established in 2009. I was Health Secretary at the time. From memory, Jackson Carlow may have been shadow health spokesperson at the time. It was asked then to undertake at least one announced and one unannounced inspection of all acute hospitals across the NHS every 3 years. The hospitals to be subject to inspections were published at the commencement of the programme in 2009. They covered acute general hospitals, children's hospitals and maternity facilities. From October 2010, the Golden Jubilee, the ambulance service and the State Hospital were also included, and from 2013 we rolled the programme out further to include inspections of community hospitals. Inspections, as I'm sure Jackson Carlaw is aware, are based on intelligence and they are risk-based. Based on HEI inspections since 2009, facilities visits have covered more than 90% of the acute and community hospital beds in NHS Scotland. Since starting inspections, 259 reports on the safety and cleanliness of hospitals have been published, and in the last financial year, 16 inspection reports have been published. I'll go back to a point I made a moment ago, though. It is important that there is a risk-based approach taken to inspections, which is why I'm sure it will be the case that acute hospitals are perhaps inspected more regularly than smaller community-based hospitals. And of course, it is up to the Healthcare Environment Inspectorate to set the schedule for those inspections, and that's, I'm sure, as all of us would expect.
Jackson Carlaw.
And finally, I'd like to raise the key issue of how hospitals respond when faced with tragic incidents. Obviously, patients and families need to have confidence that when a case like this emerges, everything is done to minimise the spread of infection any further. The current national guidance says that an investigation should only begin when 2 or more cases of the same type of bacteria are found. Now, given the concerns raised over recent weeks, does the First Minister believe that the framing of the guidance remains sufficiently robust and clear? And would she encourage health boards to examine the plans they have to see if improvements can be made?
First Minister.
Well, in light of these kind of incidents, my starting point would be that we should always review protocols and procedures and guidance that are in place, and that will be the case in these instances, and health boards should always make sure that they are responding appropriately. Of course, the kind of guidance that Jackson Carlaw is referring to will be informed by expert opinion, and that is right and proper. In terms of the procedure that's in place right now for reporting infections, there is the Healthcare Infection Incident Assessment tool, which health boards are required to follow, and that is followed by infection prevention and control teams or health protection teams to assess every healthcare infection incidents, and that means all outbreaks and incidents in any healthcare setting. And as I think I said a moment ago, but it is worth repetition, we consider that each of the cases that have been reported over the last couple of weeks have followed this procedure. The tool, in brief, Presiding Officer, has 2 parts. Firstly, it assesses the impact of a healthcare infection incident or outbreak on patients, on services and on public health. And secondly, it supports a single channel of infection incident outbreak assessment and information reporting, both internally within the Health Board area and then externally to Health Protection Scotland and the Scottish Government, and that includes, of course, public reporting and the preparation of information for the media as well. That, I think, is a robust procedure. I remember as Health Secretary having cause on more than one occasion to look at that and to look at boards' compliance with that. But I do think it's important when we've had infection outbreaks such as those we've been speaking about that we do review these procedures, and if any changes are considered to be required, then those changes should be made.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, new figures released this week confirmed that for the first time in a decade, homelessness in Scotland is rising. As a result, 2 days ago, Shelter declared that Scotland faces a housing emergency, and that, I quote, "The upcoming budget should be seen as an opportunity for the Scottish Government to ensure councils are properly resourced to deal with this unacceptable rise in homelessness in Scotland." Does the First Minister, in all conscience, really believe that a £319 million cut to local government is properly resourcing Scotland's councils?
First Minister.
Well, the Finance Secretary, of course, will set out his budget statement later on this afternoon. I very much hope we can reach an agreement that delivers a majority for that budget at 5 o'clock this evening. Work on that continues. I should say work on that doesn't continue with the Labour Party, because we are still waiting for Labour to bring forward any credible proposals for the budget. I know, to be fair, Alec Rowley, I'm not sure if he's in the chamber, did bring forward proposals. He's a front bencher, but it turned out they weren't approved by the rest of the Labour Party. But on to Onto the important issue of homelessness, and I agree very much with Shelter's sentiments here. I think in order to provide, firstly, the context, the long-term trend shows a significant decrease in the number of applications for the number of homelessness applications. The slight rise this year follows an 8-year decline in homelessness applications, and all of the evidence suggests that that is largely down to welfare changes, which both I and Richard Leonard oppose. We differ on whether or not this Parliament should be responsible for the welfare system. It's also important to note that these figures predate the establishment of the Ending Homelessness Together action plan, which was published in November with 70 different recommendations backed by organisations like Shelter and Crisis, who were both represented on the task force that produced those recommendations. And going back to the budget point, we have also committed to a £50 million Ending Homelessness Together fund, and committed £23.5 million from that fund to support a transformation around rapid rehousing. So this is an issue of the utmost seriousness, and this government takes it extremely seriously, as will be reflected not just in our budget but in the other work that we are doing with organisations such as Shelter.
Richard Leonard.
Well, the First Minister is referring to a fund that's worth £50 million over 5 years, compared to a budget that cuts council funding by more than 6 times in 1 year alone, that same amount. And back to this Parliament, as it stands, the budget we will vote on this afternoon cuts council funding by £319 million. This is about cuts to social work, to housing and homelessness support services, and cuts in the number of staff to deliver them. As a result, people in need, including children in need, are falling through the cracks. In the 12 months up to September 2017, 833 households cited a lack of support from health, housing and social work services as the reason for their homelessness. This week, the government announced the figure for the year ending September 2018. Can the First Minister tell us if that figure was up or down?
First Minister.
Well, I'm going to guess that Richard Leonard wouldn't be asking me if it was down, so I'm sure that it is up. In terms of the issue that Richard Leonard, I don't have the figure to hand. I will happily supply it after this session. But these are important issues. In terms of the rise in the last year in homelessness after an 8-year decline, everybody, including the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty, knows that that is largely down to changes in welfare, changes that I oppose but do not have the ability to influence because we don't have power in this Parliament. Notwithstanding that, we are taking action through the work we did through the task force and the recommendations that came from that, through the Ending Homelessness Together fund, to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping, and we will continue to work with organisations in order to deliver improvements there. But when Richard Leonard is talking about the budget, and I repeat again, we're delivering in this draft budget a real terms increase to councils, but we have been prepared to listen to parties who say that that doesn't go far enough. We've simply made the point to parties that if they want us to increase money to local government, they have to come forward and tell us where that money should come from. Labour have failed to do so. The Greens are the only party that have come forward and made constructive proposals. But on the budget, of course, on the budget, perhaps the most significant item in the budget relating to homelessness and housing, which Richard Leonard didn't mention, is the £826 million being invested by this government to deliver new affordable housing. That fundamentally is a key part of how we tackle homelessness, by building more houses, something that previous Labour administrations weren't all that successful at, but which this government has been determined to prioritise and will continue to prioritise exactly that.
Richard Leonard.
Well, the facts from the government's own figures released this week are that 1,178 households found themselves homeless in Scotland in the last year as a result of a lack of support from these public services. That's a rise of 41%. First Minister, our councils have a legal duty to vulnerable people, including children. And you have a moral duty to deliver the funding that they need. By asking this Parliament to vote for a budget that cuts council services by over £300 million, you are failing in that duty.
Order, please. Let's hear the question.
The last time I asked the First Minister about homelessness in this chamber, she told me for as long as one single person is homeless or rough sleeping in our country, we still have work to do. First Minister, your budget last year led to the first rise in homelessness in a decade and a housing emergency. Why is your response to that emergency and that rise to cut council funding this year even further?
First Minister.
Council funding is increasing, and Derek Mackay will set out further details of that later on. In terms of homelessness, I stand by absolutely what I said before. Homelessness and rough sleeping is not acceptable. The increase in homelessness is down to welfare cuts and changes. Everybody understands that. I believe Richard Leonard, in his heart, understands that. And if he joined with me in calling for responsibility over welfare to be held in this Parliament, perhaps we could do something more about that. But notwithstanding that, we continue to take action through the recommendations I've spoken about, through the fund I've spoken about, working with organisations like Shelter and Crisis and with local authorities to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. We're also investing record sums in building new affordable housing, and our budget reflects all of that. I go back to this point though. Richard Leonard talks about the budget and makes criticisms of the budget. He has failed to bring forward a single alternative budget proposal, and that is simply not acceptable. I mentioned earlier on the Alec Rowley proposal, and credit to Alec Rowley, at least he brought forward a proposal. Given he's a front bencher, we assumed it was an official Labour proposal, but they can't even get their act together to agree with each other on the budget, let alone agree with anybody else on the budget. But in that proposal, Alec Rowley suggested that we free up more money for local government by effectively taking 3% out of every other budget except health. That would have included social security. So taking 3% out of our own social security budget is the closest that Labour came to making any budget proposal. So I'd simply say this to Richard Leonard: if he wants anybody, not just me, but anybody across the country, to take Labour seriously on the budget, he really has to do more than stand up here and moan. He actually has to start bringing forward some proposals, because he hasn't done so far.
Now, there are a lot of members wish to ask supplementary questions today. We'll see how many we get through. The first from Alistair Allen, to be followed by Alexander Burnett. Alistair Allen.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government can do to assist the workforce of the Talk Talk call centre in Stornoway in my constituency, who have just learned that they are all to lose their jobs this summer. The First Minister will appreciate that 59 job losses leaves a very big hole in a small self-contained island economy, perhaps comparable to 1,800 job losses in Glasgow. Can I urge the Scottish Government and its agencies to do everything possible now to seek alternative options, as well as to help these workers and the wider community?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Alistair Allen for raising this issue? I was very concerned to learn of the developments at Talk Talk in Stornoway yesterday, and the impact this will have on the employees affected, as well as on the local community and economy. And the point that Alistair Allen makes about scale here, I think, is a point very well made. Our agency, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, is already in direct contact with Talk Talk, both at local and at national level, and we are committed to doing everything possible to address this situation urgently in the hope of obtaining a positive outcome. Of course, in the unfortunate event of individuals facing redundancy, we stand ready to provide support through the PACE initiative, but of course our first priority is to explore all options for avoiding redundancies, and I know the Economy Minister will be happy to liaise further with Alistair Allen about the action we are taking and any further action that it is considered the Scottish Government and our agencies could take.
Alexander Burnett, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I'm sure the First Minister will have seen last weekend's newspapers regarding the 13-year detention of Kyle Gibbon at Carstairs, where it was quoted that the Scottish Government had announced plans to hold an inquiry into why Mr Gibbon, alongside 8 other people with autism or learning difficulties, have been detained in the maximum security hospital. Now, a previous article in December said the Minister for Mental Health would be carrying out an inquiry into Carstairs by the end of January. So can the First Minister confirm that Kyle's case is being investigated?
First Minister.
Well, I will ask the Mental Health Minister to correspond with the member with more detail of this. I would say, and I know, I hope everybody across the chamber will understand that due to patient confidentiality, it wouldn't be appropriate for me or the government to comment on individual patient cases. What I would say is this: diagnosis of a behavioural disorder itself is certainly not cause for detention, and there are significant safeguards where compulsory treatment is necessary, including, of course, the right of appeal. Admission to the state hospital is based on diagnosis of mental disorder requiring treatment under conditions of special security, which can't be suitably cared for in a hospital other than the state hospital. The Mental Health Minister pays very close attention to cases like this one, and we will do everything possible to ensure that all rules and regulations are properly being adhered to. And I will ask the Minister, as I said a moment ago, to write to the member with whatever further detail it is appropriate to share with him.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you. First Minister, over 20 homeless people have died since mid-November in Glasgow from the availability of a high-strength street Valium known as street blues. It's 3 deaths a week. Drug users have been warned that they are dicing with death. First Minister, it is unprecedented and it presents a new problem on our streets. Last month, a drug gang was jailed for producing at least 1.6 million worth of this street Valium, but it hasn't dented the supply. Of course, the problem is not confined to Glasgow, it's in other cities in Scotland, but it is certainly biggest in Glasgow. Can the First Minister assure Parliament that there will be a considered response to looking at ensuring that people are warned about the severe dangers of this drug? But First Minister, I know that there has to be a much wider look, perhaps a multi-agency approach, to get these deadly drugs off our streets to save lives where we can.
First Minister.
Well, Pauline McNeill raises a very important issue. This is an issue that has affected my own constituency in the past, so I'm very well aware both of the issues underlying this question, but also the impact on individuals and communities. We are obviously aware of an increase in street Valium being implicated in deaths. It's usually when it's used in combination with opiates. There are significant harms associated with polydrug use. Most drug-related deaths are of people who take more than one substance. I can tell the Chamber today that Glasgow Alcohol and Drug Partnership has already met to discuss this issue and to discuss what further action can be taken to respond. They continue to promote a range of outreach activity as well as providing harm reduction information specifically on this issue of street Valium. They're implementing a treatment protocol for the management of dependence associated with the use of street Valium for those most at risk, and identifying barriers to treatment through focus groups with people at risk who are not already in contact with treatment services. And we will continue to work closely with all alcohol and drug partnerships to monitor drug trends and to make sure that public information is as it should be. We also work closely with the police on all aspects of drug policy and enforcement, including counterfeit prescription medication. So these are important issues, and all agencies involved have a responsibility to ensure that the action that is being taken meets the challenge that is posed. And I'd be very happy to ask one of the health ministers, Public Health Minister, to meet with Pauline McNeill if she wants further information on the actions being taken and the discussions being undertaken.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of reports of blue water at Buchanan and St Ambrose High Schools in Coatbridge. She may also be aware of reports that staff have been warned against speaking to parents or politicians about this issue. Can she outline what steps the Scottish Government can take to ensure a full investigation into this problem by North Lanarkshire Council, and to ensure that the Council is keeping parents, families and pupils involved and informed in a fully transparent manner?
First Minister.
Well, Scottish Government officials have been in contact with North Lanarkshire Council about this issue, and I understand the concerns that are being raised. The Council has informed us that a range of measures are already being taken, including replacing pipework, and that's a process that the advises will be complete next month. The Council has also advised that parents and pupils have been kept informed by letter. I would say that clear communication of the issue and the steps being taken to address it is clearly in everyone's best interest, and I would encourage the Council to ensure that that is done. I can advise and assure Fulton McGregor that my officials will continue to liaise with the Council and offer any appropriate support as they seek to resolve this serious issue.
Maurice Corrie, followed by John Mason.
The First Minister may be aware of the recent outbreak of hepatitis A at St Mary's Primary School in my region, resulting in staff and pupils having to be vaccinated. The source of the outbreak is currently unknown, so what assurances can the First Minister give that measures will be taken to fully investigate this and prevent it from happening again?
Well, again, this is an important and serious issue to raise. Vaccination has been undertaken. It's either ongoing or completed, but that is an important step that has been taken. And obviously, investigations will continue to try to identify the source of this. And health ministers will be more than prepared to keep the member and other members who have an interest updated as more information becomes available.
John Mason.
Thank you. I wonder if the First Minister can give any reassurance to the community in Dalmarnock about the future of the Legacy Hub, which is a fabulous facility funded by the Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council, Clyde Gateway and the Lottery, as a legacy from the Commonwealth Games, which sadly has now closed as the Trust has gone into administration.
First Minister.
Well, I was really saddened to hear of the People's Development Trust entering administration and to hear about the impact this has had on the staff of the Trust and indeed the local community who have relied on its services. Glasgow City Council staff, I know, have met with parents affected by the closure of the nursery to discuss the options available for replacement childcare and the availability of nursery places within a 2-mile radius. The Council is rightly leading on engagement with the Administrator with the aim of ensuring that the hub can remain an important asset for the community in the future. That is fundamentally a matter for the Administrator and for Glasgow City Council. However, we absolutely recognise the importance of the Legacy Hub to the people of Glasgow, so the Government will remain in close contact with the Council and with interested parties as the situation evolves, and we will offer any support that it is appropriate for us to offer, including, if it is necessary, through the PACE initiative for any members of staff faced with losing their jobs.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Greens have regularly raised the issue of Scottish Government support to the arms industry, and in particular to Raytheon, the third largest arms firm in the world and largest producer of guided missiles. They sell missiles to Saudi Arabia, where they've been linked to alleged war crimes such as bombing civilians. When we raise these issues, we're often told, as the Ferret were recently in publishing a report by the Scottish Government, we're very clear that we expect the UK Government to properly police the export of arms. Presiding Officer, I don't expect that. I fully expect that the UK Government will continue to facilitate arms sales to human rights abusers, to countries involved in war crimes and atrocities around the world. I don't think people in Scotland should be expecting that the Scottish Government will continue to back this industry. But just in the last week, my colleague Ross Greer has published research showing, if members would like to hear this, perhaps some of them don't care. My colleague, Mr Greer, has published research showing that Scottish Enterprise is providing bespoke services to that company to help them grow by offering advice, help accessing finance, and help them access new markets. Presiding Officer, what on earth is the justification for the Scottish public to be backing an industry like this, to grow its business, a company with reported sales of some £22 billion in 2017? Isn't it time for the First Minister to reverse the Scottish Government's support for the arms industry?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I have not personally seen the research from Ross Greer that Patrick Harvey refers to. It may be available to the Government. I'm more than happy to ask Government officials to take a look at that. What I would say, though, and I've said it before in the Chamber in response to previous questions Patrick Harvey has raised on this issue, is that the Scottish Government and our enterprise and skills agencies do not provide funding for the manufacture of munitions, that is weapons or ammunition, particularly for military use. Any support that we give for companies like Raytheon is focused on projects for non-military uses and for business diversification. For example, laser guidance components have a broad range of navigation uses, including for landing guidance for helicopters. Of course, as Patrick Harvey himself has alluded to, licences for arms sales are provided by the UK Government. So we will continue to provide support for firms in areas like innovation, workplace efficiencies and training. These firms do support a large number of jobs in Scotland, but we do not and will not provide support for weapons or ammunition or munitions in general.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, yes, the First Minister does often use the word diversification as a cover for this support to the arms industry. And I wonder if the First Minister can tell us anything about the extent to which diversification has in fact happened, because according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, in 2007, 97% of Raytheon's total sales were arms sales. In 2017, it was 94%. What we're seeing is not diversification, it is the opposite of diversification. And the government support through account management through Scottish Enterprise is specifically to grow this business and to help them access new markets. Can the First Minister tell us anything that the Scottish Government intends to do differently in the future? And meanwhile, isn't the case overwhelming to withdraw this constant stream of support from the public purse for this company and others to grow their lethal business?
First Minister.
Well, in terms of Raytheon, the Scottish Enterprise funding to Raytheon has supported a range of activity for diversification into non-military and civilian markets and to help re-site Raytheon administrative staff. It is not funding to support munitions, ammunition or weapons, and that remains the case. There are jobs supported by these companies. Of course, these are often global companies that don't just operate in Scotland, so their overall business will depend on what they do in a range of different countries, but that is the focus of support for Scottish Enterprise. I remain open to hearing concerns about this, to looking at whether there are any changes to the procedures that Scottish Enterprise uses to tighten that up. But I don't make an apology for our enterprise agencies trying to support our economy and to support jobs. Often in this chamber, members rightly, understandably raise concerns about job losses. The job of the government and the job of Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise is to try to create employment and support employment. But Patrick Harvey is right. It's important that that is done ethically and morally, and that is what Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise does. And we will continue to listen to views on this. And if there are changes that we can make, we're happy to consider them.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
Vulnerable disabled school children are being physically and mentally harmed by restraint practices in Scottish schools that may be illegal. This is the conclusion of a report by the Children's Commissioner. Over 2,600 incidents were recorded in just 1 year. 2,600 doesn't sound like a last resort to me. The Scottish Government has until the end of today to respond to this report. What will the Government say?
First Minister.
Well, we will respond to the Commissioner's report. I believe that will be done by the end of this week, which is within the time that we are required to do it. We will respond to the Commissioner. I think it is courteous that we do that, but the guidance that is in place already, and of course we will look to make changes if that is required, is very clear about the importance of de-escalation in situations where restraint may be considered, and that restraint must only ever be used in cases of absolute last resort. That is exceptionally important, and we will, however, respond to the Commissioner and look to make changes to guidance or to practice if that is considered to be appropriate and necessary.
Willie Rennie.
Last week, the First Minister told me to wait and see what she was going to do on the UN demands on the age of criminal responsibility. This morning, her MSPs voted to reject them. So I think it's fair to question the First Minister and her commitment to children's rights rather than to wait and see. Absolutely. A child with a mental age of 3 was left traumatised and distraught after being locked in a school cloakroom. There are reports of children being tied to chairs, prevented from going to the toilet, and being dragged across the floor, causing injury. These children's voices are often not heard, so it is important for us to speak up for them. The Children's Commissioner said the government is not complying with the advice from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. The Commissioner said that guidance is inconsistent and ambiguous, and he is not certain that restraint is used as a last resort. So will she take the advice of the Children's Commissioner and dramatically cut the use of restraint on vulnerable, disabled children in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I'd say to Willie Rennie, there's probably never, or certainly rarely, a week goes by when I don't personally and very directly listen to the voices of children and young people. It's a very important part of the job that I do, and it's a very important part of how this government conducts itself. We meet as a full cabinet once a year with the Scottish Children's Parliament and the Youth Parliament, just as one symbolic example of our commitment to hearing young people's voices. Yes, of course, we will respond to the Commissioner, and if there is a view that changes are required, we will make those changes. And we will continue to take whatever action is necessary to support a system overall in Scotland, not just in the cases that Willie Rennie is citing here, but generally in Scotland, that is respectful of children's rights and puts children's interests at the very heart of everything that we do. Of course, we have given a commitment to incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law, and that will require a whole range of work to be taken, no doubt, across the Scottish Government to ensure that we are fully compliant with that. That's an important indication of how seriously we take these issues, and where we fall short, as all governments will from time to time, then what is important is that we recognise that and we take the action to rectify it, and that is the commitment that I have personally as First Minister, and it's a commitment that runs right through our entire government.
I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'll try to squeeze a couple of supplementaries in. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of reports this week about a dental student who was convicted of serious sexual abuse against a child but was given an absolute discharge, which has devastated the family. I know the First Minister cannot comment on individual cases, but does the First Minister agree with me that serious sexual offences against children should be punished severely and that we need to see more transparency around sentencing such as this?
First Minister.
Well, in general terms, of course, I agree with the sentiment of that question. In terms of this particular case, and I'm grateful to the member for acknowledging that I cannot comment on the detail. I absolutely understand the concerns that have been expressed about what has been reported about this sentence, but the sentencing decision in any criminal case is entirely a matter for the judge. The judiciary acts entirely independently on the basis of the facts and circumstances of individual cases. They will take into account a wide range of factors, including the age of the offender and any previous convictions. It may be that the member is genuinely not aware of this, because I think it happened only shortly before First Minister's questions, but the Court has issued a statement this morning providing more detail on the factors behind this particular case. I won't go into the detail of that. It will be available for members to read, but it does, in the closing paragraph, describe the decision in this case as wholly exceptional. And I think that is undoubtedly a fair description. So I understand the concerns, but we must protect the principle in this country that sentencing decisions are not a matter for politicians, however controversial and difficult they can be for the public. Sentencing decisions are rightly and properly matters for judges.
Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister to update Parliament on the ongoing teacher pay negotiations and what the current offer would mean for those on the lowest pay grades?
First Minister.
Well, of course, the teachers' pay ballot, I know, opens today, so this is an issue that is very much in the hands of teachers. However, an improved offer has been made to teachers, and the additional investment required to fund that offer, of course, will be provided by the Scottish Government. For all teachers on the main grade, this deal will involve an increase of 9% by April this year, with another 3% in April next year. For the lowest paid teachers, they will see an increase in their salaries by 16% by April this year and almost 20% by April next year, which is important because we know one of our challenges is attracting more people into the teaching profession, and I hope that that will help us to do so. Teachers at the top of the pay scale will also see their pay rise to more than £41,000 by April next year. And lastly, the restructuring of the pay scale means that teachers will reach the top of the scale faster within 5 years. It is, of course, now for teachers to decide, but I hope teachers will look at the detail of this offer, and I very much hope they will decide to back this deal, because I believe it's in the interests of the teaching profession and it's in the interests of pupils the length and breadth of the country.
Question number 5, Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what support the Scottish Government provides to mountain rescue services.
First Minister.
Scottish Government provides annual grant funding of more than £300,000 to Scottish Mountain Rescue to help all 28 volunteer mountain rescue teams carry out their work. We are the only government in the UK to fund mountain rescue in this way. We're also contributing £100,000 over 3 years from 2016-17 to help towards the cost of replacing the Scottish Mountain Rescue team's ageing VHF radio equipment, as well as assisting them with the procurement process. Scottish Government officials also work collaboratively with Police Scotland, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency and Scottish Mountain Rescue to help resolve any issues around search and rescue which arise from time to time.
Gail Ross.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. As we now see harsher weather conditions across the country, would the First Minister go into further detail on the ongoing dialogue between the Scottish Government, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency and Police Scotland in relation to helicopter support? And does the First Minister agree with me that the voluntary work of the Scottish Mountain Rescue Service is absolutely invaluable?
First Minister.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. Mountain rescue volunteers, including, of course, the cave and dog teams, do a vital job, often putting their own lives at risk, and I'm sure we would all want to take the opportunity to thank them for that. There has, of course, been recent concern around search and rescue helicopter support. The levers for change around that remain with the UK Government and Department for Transport. However, following recent discussions between Police Scotland and the Coast Guard Agency, we understand that guidance has been updated to help address the issues raised around support for body recovery and for lifting volunteers from the hill following a rescue. Police Scotland's helicopter has also been introduced as a last resort to assist mountain rescue teams with body recovery to help improve the situation. And I understand that the chief pilots of both Prestwick and Inverness air crews met with the 4 independent mountain rescue teams just before Christmas to discuss how they can better work together going forward.
Question number 6, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to address the risk of young people being exposed to harmful content on social media.
First Minister.
Internet safety regulation and legislation is a reserved matter. However, we're taking action where we can to keep young people safe online, not least by working with Education Scotland to ensure that internet safety has been embedded into Curriculum for Excellence and the School Inspection Quality Framework. We published a National Action Plan on internet safety for children and young people and are working with the police, education and third sector partners to consider new and emerging risks. In particular, we recently commissioned a study into the reported worsening mental well-being of young people, focusing specifically on teenage girls. The results of that study will be published shortly and will include analysis of the role of technology and social media.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer, and I'm sure the First Minister will have seen there is clear will from the UK Government and elsewhere to ensure that social media companies are held to account to protect children and young people from harmful content, the shocking implications of which have been made all too stark with recent events. And would the First Minister agree with me that, as well as ensuring that social media companies take their responsibilities seriously it's equally important that we educate children early about the risks and realities of using social media and what to do when problems arise. And with that in mind, can she also tell me what action the Scottish Government will take to promote this approach?
First Minister.
Well, I think I covered in my original answer some of the action that we are taking to ensure that internet safety is embedded into the school curriculum, because I agree with the point that education here is vital. I think we all want to have a situation where young people can enjoy and take advantages of the enormous benefits of the internet, but also to make sure that they are safe. That is often a difficult balance to strike, and everybody has to play their part in that. The internet social media providers have a key responsibility here, and I agree it is vital that they are properly held to account. They're in a very powerful and privileged position, and their responsibilities must be taken by them very seriously. But education helps to empower young people into themselves, knowing and understanding the risks, and therefore being able to avoid the risks. So to conclude where I started, the importance of embedding this into education and the school inspection framework is essential, and that is work that the Government is committed to continuing to take forward.
Thank you very much. And that concludes First Minister's questions.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK Government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.